Welcome to another episode of Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here at the News Forum where all voices matter. As the Russian invasion of Ukraine grinds on, the primary response of the West has been a series of sweeping sanctions against Putin and his country. But how do these sanctions actually work, and what are their efficacy? Here to discuss is Clifford Sosnow. He is a partner at the law firm of Fasken Martineau DuMoulin LLP. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me on.
I guess first, what is your assessment of the sanctions so far?
Because they're a global response, because they're so swift, they are having an impact. Russia is having difficulty right now, possibly paying its foreign debt obligations. Companies have decided to pull back from the Russian economy. Many of clients that I deal with are having more and more difficulty in terms of whether or not they want to do business in Russia, and the sanctions are a key part of it. So I would say that the sanctions are like a barrel of molasses that has been put in front of somebody, and it's just made doing business much, much more difficult. So I would say they are having efficacy, they are having an effect, Tony, but it takes time. Sanctions do, by their definition, take time to ramp up, and we're starting to see that happening right now.
Are there some sanctions that are working better than other sanctions right now?
It's a global impact, but the fact that Canada, the US, the EU have all sanctioned most of the major banks in Russia is clearly having an impact, because it prevents actually doing business if you can't do business through the banks. The other element that's having a business is just the sheer scope of companies and people that are being sanctioned. Right. And the people that are being sanctioned have very, very deep layers into the Russian economy. And so it's not only dealing with the sanctioned people, you're also dealing with the people that they own or control or have an influence over. And so all of a sudden, there is just a very, very large list of prohibited people, companies, individuals, with whom businesses can't be done. And those are very, very effective.
Yeah, I guess one of the things that really surprised me was how, as you mentioned, that individual companies and organizations, even non-corporate actors, are taking sanctions seriously in their bailiwick, and everything from having cat competitions that will not allow Russian or Belarusian cats, but more seriously, obviously, Abramovich having to sell his British soccer team. So, is that something that surprised you as well? Just how broad this move to sanction has really gotten?
The rapidity of the response has really surprised me. But the truth of the matter is, we're dealing with an invasion. And the broadness, in particular the European move to broaden the sanctions to energy imports that are so key to their economy, did surprise me. They say the absolute extent of the number of individuals did surprise me as well. But what we've seen is a slow buildup in the number of entities, in the number of people that have been sanctioned. It's almost a kind of proportionate response. Right. As the invasion, as the aggression continues. The more savage it's become, and I apologize for using that word, the more difficult it has become, the more the greater the response, the more the pressure to ramp up that response. And so it hasn't surprised me in the sense of the events that we're dealing with. The unanimity of the response, the unanimity of the depth of the response is something that has surprised me.
Yeah, and obviously the Western nations that are involved in this, they've got more to do. They haven't exhausted the potential sanctions. Is that right?
That's right. There's several additional steps. I'm going to use the word nuclear option, and I'll explain to you why I'm using that in a second. But there are several layers of sanctions that could still be employed. Right now, Russia is not completely walled off by Europe, North American economies, the major economies. But all of the countries and the regions that I've talked about each have within their disposal tools that can prevent any and all commercial dealings with Russia.
Welcome back to Boom and Bust. Clifford, you were just about to mention the expansion of sanctions. Please continue with your thought.
Yeah, so Russia is not walled off from the major economies of the world, but each of the major economies of the world have within their power the ability to, in effect, embargo Russia. And that means to stop any and all business with Russia. Canada has done that in the past with Belarus. It currently is doing that with respect to North Korea, where businesses can only be done under a license, typically for humanitarian purposes. But short of that, can't really do business with North Korea, and up until 2017, couldn't do business with Belarus. There is some call for Russia to be added onto this kind of embargo list, where nothing can be done absent government approval under a license, but so far that really hasn't been done. Of course, there's the entire banking system of Russia can be sanctioned, and right now that hasn't happened. It's mainly the legacy banks, but they haven't included yet the challenge banks, the ones that are not bricks and mortar operations. They could do those. There are any number of additional manufacturing and commodity plays that they could also include in the manufacturing orbit that they haven't done yet. So if I could just finish off the thought, there's clearly several quivers in their several arrows in their quiver that they can use, but they haven't yet at this stage of the game.
There's an interesting debate going on in the crypto world about the desire or efficacy to shut off payment systems using Bitcoin or some other cryptocurrency. Have you been following that at all?
Yes, and I know that Biden has asked many of the cryptocurrency exchanges to stop using any accounts that come from Russia. And the response has been from several of the cryptocurrency exchanges, we really are not going to be able to do that absent some kind of a legal regime that prevents us from engaging in any of those cryptocurrency accounts. I would make the argument that those cryptocurrency accounts, being digital currency in a form of asset, frankly, are caught already by the sanctions. But apparently that's not necessarily a view that's been held by the administration in the US. I will say that cryptocurrency, when you really think about it, the Russian economy is a very US dollar denominated economy. And for the cryptocurrency exchange to take its place is going to require, frankly, very, very significant changes to enable the kind of smooth commercial transactions that currently are being done using the US dollar that right now can't be done. So it's there, I'm aware of it. Frankly, they're operating in a gray zone as to whether or not they're in violation of the sanctions. But I certainly don't see that as an alternative pipeline to a US dollar denominated economy.
Now, let's talk about how Russia is or could circumvent the sanctions. Any thoughts on that so far?
Well, we are seeing that they do have an alliance with China, and there are rumors, and of course, we don't have full details out with respect to those rumors, that China has offered to supply military equipment, parts for airplanes, for tanks, and also quote unquote economic resources. We also are aware that Russia is looking to engage with India. India, of course, is a net importer of energy, oil, and gas, and they're prepared to take that off the hands of the Russians, provided that is offered at a very, very significant and very deep discount. So Russia is feeling its way to other markets that are significant players, not as big as Europe, not as big as North America, but nevertheless significant players that can provide that additional resource, that can provide, frankly, the military equipment that they're looking for, that can provide the very badly needed foreign exchange reserves. I would also add in several Latin American countries like Colombia, Brazil, of course, Venezuela, Nicaragua.
One of the things that has been talked about is the commercial fleet that reportedly has been seized by the Russian government. These are leased airplanes, commercial planes that the leases were pulled, and they should have been flown back to the owners of those planes. But apparently, the reporting is that the Russian government has allowed those commercial aircraft to stay in Russia and continue to be used. I'd love to get your comment on that, as well as your comments on utilizing McDonald's assets in Moscow. Apparently that's happening as well. Welcome back. Clifford, I gave you something to chew on before the break there. What's going on with circumvention of sanctions? The planes, the McDonald's, whatever else is going on. Give us your perspective on those things.
What you've given me to chew on, Tony, has been pretty rocky. I will say that the use of vacated assets, they are the assets that are owned or controlled by McDonald's and other corporations, unless Russia passes particular laws that in effect expropriate those assets. Those are the assets of McDonald's and other corporations. And Russia, under international law, is required to compensate for those assets. But this is just a simple way of Putin and the Russian regime of asking companies not to vacate their assets from Russia and to continue on doing business in Russia. The problem for the McDonald's of the world is a lot of their supplies that come from Russia may be coming from sanctioned parties. They may be using banks that may be sanctioned. And then, of course, they have investor risk, where their investors are saying to them, how can you sell hamburgers in Russia and provide badly needed currency and make profits from your sales while people are being killed in Ukraine? So for the McDonald's of the world, it's a really difficult issue. They are vacating. This is Putin's response to trying to keep them in there. Unfortunately for him, there are very significant and very well-known international rules that would require compensation. And so we're looking at the potential for very, very significant legal challenges in the years to come, if and when the peace is resumed. And it's the same thing for the leased aircraft. They're leased aircraft. They're not aircraft that are owned by the particular companies that use them. This is, again, within Russia's, in many ways, desperation for keeping assets within Russia that are leased by companies that are affected by the sanctions. And so those companies are leaving. And when they leave, they take their assets with them. And that has an impact on the functioning of the economy. And so we talked about initially at the beginning of this conversation, what is the impact of the sanctions? The using of the assets of McDonald's, the prohibition on the return of the aircraft under these leases. These are all Exhibit A, Exhibit B, Exhibit C, what have you, that the sanctions are really, really starting to bite. And you're having extraordinary interventions by the Russian government to try to keep these assets and enable the economy to function as normal as possible.
In terms of sanctions, does that mean that those sanctions, I guess they remain on and could still intensify even if there's no further major military conflict in Ukraine?
Absolutely. There's a couple of issues that all of the countries that are imposing sanctions have problems with. One of them is the possession of the so-called breakaway republics in the Donbass region, bordering on Western Russia, Eastern Ukraine. There's no indication that those would be returned to Ukraine. There's also Crimea. They're all embargo territories, and as long as Russia maintains control over those embargo territories, the sanctions will remain. Also, Russia has done, I think it's fair to say, enormous damage to Ukraine, and enormous damage to the Ukrainian economy. And so even if there was a ceasefire, even if there was a installation of a puppet government, those sanctions would remain in place. I will say that if there is a puppet government, it clearly would be not one recognized
Right.
by the Western countries. And really, what is the incentive at that point to remove the sanctions?
Right, right. So they could be there for a long time to come. Um, I guess from your perspective, then, is this the most appropriate way to deal with Russia at this point?
Sanctions are I'm going to use the word, a chronic response. They have immediate effect, but they take effect over time. And they can be very, very crippling. And we've seen that in Iran, and we're starting to see that in Russia. But it takes time. And while that time happens, unfortunately, people are dying.
Yeah.
Infrastructure is being destroyed. But sanctions were never an intended method of actually stopping the violence.
Right.
What they were intended to do was to.
I'm going to take another brief break. I'm sorry to cut you off, but we will come back to you right after the break. Please stay with us. Very important conversation. Welcome back. Continuing our discussion with Clifford Sosnow. He's a partner at the law firm of Fasken Martineau DuMoulin. Clifford, please continue your thought before the break.
The question is this an appropriate response? And as I've indicated, it has had and will continue to have, unfortunately, over the next several months, a very, very, very significant impact, not only on Russia, but on all the economies that are dealing with Russia, and will start to have an impact in Canada, for example, on issues like inflation or whatever. Is this an appropriate response? The truth of the matter is it's one step below actual physical violence. At this stage of the game, the NATO economies, NATO countries are not yet ready and may never be ready for an actual physical invasion. There's a discussion about a no-fly zone and the controversy associated with that. Absent that, the tools that are available are both diplomatic isolation and sanctions economic, and hurting the economy very, very badly, to the point of inducing massive recession, possibly a depression, possibly in consequence, civil unrest, social unrest, possibly even regime change. So these are very, very, very serious tools that are being applied. As I mentioned earlier on, there still are other steps that could be taken that I've called the nuclear option to absolutely isolate the Russian economy. Are these the appropriate steps? Yes, they are. Will they save lives? Perhaps in the long run. Unfortunately, may not in the short run.
Mm-hmm. Obviously, one of the items that is being discussed now is revoking Russia's most favored nation status. Can you tell us a little bit about that and whether it would work?
Well, what the most favored nation status is the ability to impose tariffs and duties on importation of goods. And typically, those goods come in at a very, very low tariff rate. And think of a tariff as an additional tax on importing products. Right now, most products, or prior to the sanctions, most products came in from Russia at very, very low tariff rates or free. Since the sanctions have been imposed, a 35% tax has now been imposed on imports of any goods, think commodities, oil and gas that is refined, that might be coming from Russia. And all of a sudden, what that does is it tells buyers, I can get something a lot cheaper somewhere else than paying that additional 35% tax. I should say the only other country that's paying that 35% tax is North Korea. And so again, Russia, and I would add in Belarus, really do have pariah status in terms of the cost for Canadians of doing business with those countries. The upshot of that is, A, it reduces the ability to access, in terms of supply chains, product coming in from Russia or Belarus. 2, it makes product more expensive. 3, it makes product harder to find. 4, it provides a block of foreign exchange and badly needed foreign exchange for manufacturers in Russia who may want to use that foreign exchange to buy inputs to produce the kind of products that they need, not only for buyers abroad, but buyers in Russia. And so that MFN will not only have a bite on Canadians or Americans or Europeans, it is also intended to have a bite on the Russian economy. And so the immediate hit will be on importers and Canadians, possibly contribute to the inflationary pressures that already exist in the economy, but they're intended long-term to deprive companies in Russia of badly needed foreign exchange to buy the kinds of inputs they need to engage in ordinary day-to-day manufacturing.
We've got about a half a minute left. Is Canada, actually pre-invasion, were Canadian companies doing a lot of business with Russia?
They were doing business, investing in commodities, oil and gas, mining jurisdictions, technology. I mean, many sectors of the Russian economy are extremely advanced. It is a large economy. It's not obviously one of the largest, but it's a large economy with ties, very, very critical ties to Europe. And so we are finding several, and we know of in terms of our own business, companies that really have to rejig their thinking about doing business in Russia.
Clifford Sosnow, I think that's the end of our program today. Unfortunately, lots to talk about. Maybe we can have you back a bit later on in this event that's shaking up the world. But thanks for your time today.
Thank you for your time. Thank you.